On the edge of darkness. He was on the verge of ending it all when a poor little girl appeared and, with a simple gesture, saved his life. Grateful, he promised to repay her somehow, but fate was cruel. When he needed to save her, it was too late. The regret would haunt him forever. If this story interests you, subscribe to our channel to receive all our emotional stories. Continuing. The rain showed no mercy that September night in Chicago. Richard Morgan remained motionless by the window of his office on the 30th floor, watching the city lights that appeared blurred through the raindrops streaming down the glass. His brown eyes, once vibrant, now carried a weight that none of his professional achievements could alleviate. The wall clock showed 11:45 p.m., and the silence of the empty office was broken only by the distant sound of the storm. On his mahogany desk, a red folder contained the latest financial report of Morgan Developments, the company he had built from scratch over 20 years. Impressive numbers for anyone except for him. Not anymore. His fingers lightly brushed the cold surface of the glass as an old memory assaulted him. His mother's voice, Elizabeth Morgan, echoed in his mind. "Son, money can't buy happiness." He had laughed at those words. Now at 52, he perfectly understood what she meant. Richard straightened his tie out of habit and picked up his coat. The building's security guard was accustomed to his late departures, but tonight there was something different in his eyes, something that made old Frank hesitate before wishing him good night. The downtown streets were practically deserted. His Italian shoes, which cost the equivalent of 3 months' minimum wage, sank into puddles as he walked aimlessly. His soaked suit weighed on his shoulders, but he barely felt the discomfort. His mind was occupied with darker thoughts. He reached Jefferson Bridge almost without realizing it. The Chicago River ran violently below, its dark waters reflecting the city lights. Richard approached the railing, feeling the cold wind against his face. 60 feet of height. It would be quick, he thought, a fitting end for someone who had lost his purpose. That's when he heard a voice, small, fragile, but somehow stronger than the noise of the storm. "Mister, do you have some change to buy bread?" He turned slowly. There, soaked by the rain and trembling from cold, was a girl who couldn't have been more than 12 years old. Her black hair stuck to her thin face, and in her arms she carried a transparent plastic bag with some coins. "I have nothing to give you," he responded dryly, turning his gaze back to the river. But the girl didn't move. On the contrary, she came closer, her large eyes fixed on him with disconcerting intensity. "Are you crying, or is it just the rain?" The question caught him off guard. He brought his hand to his face and realized that there were indeed tears mixing with the rainwater. He couldn't remember the last time he had cried. "Go away, girl. It's not safe here." "Nowhere is safe," she replied with wisdom beyond her years. "But at least here there's someone to talk to." Something in her voice made him look again. His eyes met hers, and for a moment Richard saw something familiar in that gaze. An old pain, too deep for someone so young. "What's your name?" he asked, surprising himself with the sudden interest. "Sarah Miller," she answered hesitantly, "but everyone just calls me Sarah." A shout cut through the night before Richard could respond. From the other side of the bridge, a tall, thin figure emerged from the darkness, visibly staggering. "Sarah, you little brat. How many times have I told you not to go out alone?" The girl's face transformed instantly. Fear took over her features, and she instinctively took a step back, moving closer to Richard. The man advanced quickly, his bloodshot eyes fixed on the girl. Even from a distance, Richard could smell the alcohol emanating from him. "Come here." "Now!" the man shouted, extending his hand to grab Sarah's arm. It was as if something awakened inside Richard. Without thinking, he positioned himself between the man and the girl. "Step away from her." The man stopped, surprised by the unexpected intervention. His eyes scanned Richard's soaked suit, assessing the situation. "And who are you to interfere? This brat needs to learn to obey." "I said step away," Richard repeated, his voice taking on a tone he usually used in difficult negotiations. The man hesitated, swaying slightly, before taking a step forward. What happened next was quick. The man tried to push Richard, who stood firm. In the confusion, Sarah managed to dodge and ran behind Richard. The aggressor, unbalanced by alcohol and rain, almost fell. "This isn't over," muttered the man, before staggering away into the darkness. Richard felt Sarah trembling behind him. He took off his wet coat and placed it over her shoulders, surprised by his own protective gesture. "You can't go back there," he said, realizing that the words were coming out of his mouth before he could even think about them. Sarah looked at him, her large eyes full of a mixture of fear and hope. "I have nowhere to go," she whispered. Richard looked once more at the river, then at the girl. Minutes ago, he had been ready to give up everything. Now something different was growing in his chest, a feeling he hadn't felt in a long time. Purpose. "Come with me," he said, extending his hand. "Let's find a safe place." Sarah hesitated for a moment, looking at the extended hand as if it were something strange and potentially dangerous. But then, slowly, her small hand rose and held his. As they walked through the rainy night, Richard didn't know that moment would change his life forever. He didn't know that this girl, whom fate had placed in his path on a night of despair, held a secret that connected their lives in a way he could never have imagined. Richard's apartment occupied the entire top floor of a luxurious building called Gold Coast. When the elevator door opened directly into the penthouse, Sarah's eyes widened, but she said nothing. Her bare feet left small puddles on the marble floor as she followed Richard, still wrapped in his soaked coat. "Do you live here? Alone?" she asked, her voice almost a whisper, as her eyes scanned the expensive furniture and the huge floor-to-ceiling windows. Richard hesitated before answering. "Yes, since my mother passed away 5 years ago." Sarah nodded, as if she perfectly understood the weight of that loneliness. Her eyes stopped on a photograph on the wall, a younger Richard, next to a grey-haired lady with a gentle smile. "Mrs. Elizabeth," said Richard, noticing the girl's interest. "She would have liked you." "A mom." Sudden sneeze from Sarah broke the moment. Richard realized they needed to act quickly. The girl was shivering with cold in her wet clothes. "I'm going to prepare a hot bath for you," he said, guiding her to the guest room, "and I'll see if I can find some dry clothes." In the hallway closet, he found a box with his mother's old belongings. At the bottom were some clothes she had kept for donation. He selected a t-shirt and shorts that, although large for Sarah, would do for now. While the girl was taking a bath, Richard sat in the living room, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts. What was he doing? He had just brought an unknown child to his home. Should he call the police? Some shelter? But the memory of the fear in her eyes when that man appeared made him hesitate. Sarah emerged from the bathroom 20 minutes later, practically swimming in the borrowed clothes. Her hair was combed, and without the dirt from the street, Richard could see her face better. She was a pretty girl, despite the evident thinness and the deep circles under her eyes that didn't match her age. "You must be hungry," he said, standing up. "I'll prepare something for you to eat." In the immaculate kitchen, which he rarely used, Richard opened the refrigerator and found only some frozen leftover food and a half-empty bottle of wine. It had been so long since he had made a proper meal at home that he had forgotten what it was like to have real food. "I think we'll have to order something," he said, picking up the phone. "Do you like pizza?" Sarah's eyes lit up for the first time since he had found her. "I've only had pizza once when I was 8. It was my mom's birthday." Something in the way she spoke made Richard pause. "And where is your mom now, Sarah?" The girl's face closed instantly. She lowered her eyes to her hands, which were nervously intertwined in her lap. She had to go away. It's been a while." Richard realized he had touched a sensitive point and didn't insist. Instead, he ordered a large cheese pizza and sat with Sarah on the sofa while they waited. "That man, who is he?" he asked carefully. Sarah took a while to respond, her fingers playing with the hem of the oversized t-shirt. "Uncle Jack, he's not my real uncle, he's just the person who takes care of me, but he drinks a lot." Richard noticed how she shrank when speaking of him, how her shoulders tensed. There was more to that story, much more, but he knew that wasn't the moment to push. The pizza arrived, and Sarah's eyes widened when she saw the size of the box. She ate with a voracity that broke Richard's heart, as if she didn't know when she would have another meal. After eating, fatigue finally overcame her. Sarah fell asleep on the sofa, curled up like a kitten. Richard picked her up carefully and carried her to the guest room. As he covered her, he noticed something he hadn't seen before: small purple bruises on her arms, partially hidden by the sleeve of the t-shirt. His stomach churned. Those marks told a story he didn't want to imagine. He left the room silently, leaving the door slightly ajar. In the living room, he took his phone and began to search. Shelters for minors, social assistance, anything that could help. But the more he read, the more he realized it wouldn't be simple. The bureaucracy was immense, and without documents or information about Sarah's family, the options were limited. It was almost 3 in the morning when he finally went to bed, but sleep didn't come. He lay awake, listening to the sounds of the night and the occasional movements coming from Sarah's room. At some point, he heard a muffled sob. He got up and went to her door. Sarah was sitting on the bed, hugging her knees, crying silently. "Had a nightmare?" he asked softly. She nodded, quickly wiping her face with the backs of her hands. "I'm sorry, I didn't want to wake you up." Richard entered the room and sat on the edge of the bed. "No need to apologize. Want to talk about it?" Sarah shook her head negatively. "I can't. Not yet." "That's okay," he said. "You don't have to. Talk if you don't want to, but know that you're safe here." She looked at him with those big, sad eyes. "For how long?" The question caught him off guard. It was a good question. For how long? What was he planning to do? He couldn't simply keep a child in his apartment indefinitely. "For now. Don't worry about that," he answered, surprising himself, with the firmness in his voice. "We'll figure things out little by little." Sarah agreed with a nod, but Richard could see she wasn't entirely convinced. She had probably heard similar promises before. "Would you like me to stay here until you fall asleep?" he offered. To his surprise, she extended her small hand and held his. "Can you stay?" Richard sat more comfortably on the bed, leaning against the headboard. Sarah continued holding his hand, and gradually her breathing became calmer until she finally fell asleep. He stayed there, watching this child that fate had placed in his path. Hours before, he had been ready to give up everything. Now, he felt an immense responsibility weighing on his shoulders. What would he do? How could he help her? And more importantly, what had happened to Sarah? Who was this Uncle Jack really, and where was her mother? The morning was beginning to dawn when Richard finally managed to sleep, still sitting on Sarah's bed, his hand still holding hers. Outside, Chicago was awakening to another day, oblivious to the drama unfolding in the penthouse apartment. But for Richard and Sarah, nothing would be the same again. Richard woke up with a sore neck and a feeling of disorientation. It took him a few seconds to realize he was still in the guest room, sitting on the bed. Sarah was no longer there. A noise coming from the kitchen made him get up quickly. He found the girl trying to reach a glass in the high cabinet, on her tiptoes. "Good morning," he said softly so as not to startle her. Even so, Sarah jumped, almost dropping the glass. "I'm sorry, I just wanted water." "No need to apologize. This is your home now, at least for the time being." The words came out naturally but made Richard reflect. What exactly did "for the time being" mean? He needed to make some decisions, and quickly. "Do you need to go to work?" asked Sarah, noticing that he was still wearing the clothes from the day before. Richard looked at the clock, 9:45. He had already missed 2 important meetings. His cell phone was probably full of unread messages. For the first time in 20 years, this didn't seem important. "Not today," he answered, starting to prepare coffee. "Today we're going to sort some things out." Sarah sat at the kitchen table, her legs swinging without reaching the floor. She seemed smaller and more fragile in the daylight. Richard placed a glass of milk and some cookies that he found in the cupboard in front of her. "Sarah," he began, sitting across from her, "I need you to tell me a bit more about your situation. I can't help if I don't know what's happening." The girl lowered her eyes to the glass of milk, as if looking for answers on its white surface. "What do you want to know?" "First, where do you live? How do you know that man, Jack?" Sarah took a while to respond. When she spoke, her voice was almost a whisper. We lived in a tenement in Bridgeport. Uncle Jack let us stay there. Because he knew my mum. And your mum, where is she? Sarah's small hands gripped the glass tightly. She left almost a year ago. Left to go where? I don't know. A tear ran down the girl's face. She went to work one day and didn't come back. Uncle Jack said she abandoned us, that she didn't want anything to do with me anymore, but it's not true. My mum would never do that. Richard felt a lump in his throat. And you've been living with him since then? Sarah nodded. He said he'd put me in a shelter if I didn't obey, that he'd tell everyone my mum abandoned me, but it's not true. Her voice rose a little, loaded with a painful certainty. She loved me. She always said I was the most important thing in her life. Richard reached across the table, gently touching her fingers. I believe you. Sarah looked up, surprised. You really believe me? Yes, and I'm going to help you find out what happened. At that moment, the doorbell rang. Sarah instantly shrank, fear returning to her eyes. Stay here, said Richard, standing up. Through the peephole, he saw his secretary, Nancy, standing in the hallway with a concerned expression. He opened the door. Richard, thank God you didn't show up for the meetings. You're not answering your cell phone. What happened? Before he could respond, Nancy looked over his shoulder and saw Sarah in the kitchen. Her eyes widened. Who is... Nancy, interrupted Richard. I need you to cancel all my appointments today and bring me some things. He took a paper and pen, quickly making a list. Children's clothes, hygiene products, food. Nancy looked at the list with an increasingly confused expression. Richard, what's going on? Who is that girl? It's complicated, he answered. I'll explain later. Now I need you to do this for me discreetly, and Nancy, don't mention her to anyone, please. The secretary nodded, still clearly concerned, but knowing when not to ask more questions. After she left, Richard returned to the kitchen. Sarah was standing tense near the window. Is she going to tell someone? She asked, her voice trembling slightly. No. Nancy has worked with me for 15 years. We can trust her. Sarah relaxed a little, but Richard could see something was still bothering her. What is it? Why are you doing this? She finally asked. Why are you helping me? Richard thought for a moment. The truth was that he didn't know exactly. How could he explain that she had saved him that night on the bridge, even without knowing it? Because it's the right thing to do, he answered simply. Sarah studied him with those eyes too old for her age. Nobody ever does anything just because it's right. The bitterness in her voice broke Richard's heart. What had this child already lived through to have such distrust of the world? Maybe it's time someone started, he said. The rest of the morning passed slowly. Richard made some discreet calls, trying to find information about disappearances in the Bridgeport area in the last year. Sarah spent most of the time sitting on the sofa, hugging her knees, lost in thought. Nancy returned in the early afternoon with several bags. New clothes, food, hygiene items. Sarah looked at it all with a mixture of desire and distrust. You can take whatever you want, said Richard. It's all yours. Sarah approached the bags hesitantly. She picked up a light blue blouse and held it against her chest as if it were something precious. Can I really keep it? Of course you can. The girl ran to the bathroom to try on the new clothes. When she returned, she was wearing the blue blouse and a pair of jeans that finally fit her. She looked more like a normal child, not a small survivor from the streets. It was then that Richard noticed something strange. On the back of Sarah's neck, partially covered by the collar of the blouse, there was a mark. It didn't look like her bruise like the others. It was more like an old scar. Sarah, he called, trying to keep his voice casual. What is that mark on your neck? The effect was instantaneous. Sarah brought her hand to the nape of her neck, pulling her hair to cover the mark. Her face lost its color. It's nothing, she said quickly, too quickly. Sarah, I don't want to talk about it. The sudden outburst caught him by surprise. Please, don't ask. Richard nodded slowly, but his mind was already working. That mark, her reaction, there was something there. Something important. The rest of the day passed without major incidents. They had dinner together. Richard ordered food again, promising himself that he needed to learn how to cook. Sarah took another bath and put on new pajamas. When he went to put her to bed, Richard noticed that she seemed restless. "Is everything okay?" Sarah hesitated. "What if he comes looking for me?" She didn't need to say who he was. "That won't happen," Richard assured her. "This building has 24-hour security. No one gets in without my authorization." Sarah nodded but still seemed worried. "Can I sleep with the light on?" "Of course you can." Richard was almost out of the room when her voice stopped him. "Richard?" "Yes?" "Uncle Jack. He knew my mum from her work. She worked at a big place with a lot of important people." Sarah paused. She always said that one day she would tell everything, that she would do the right thing. But then her voice failed. Richard returned and sat on the edge of the bed. "What place was that, Sarah?" But the girl had already closed up again. She turned to her side, pulling the blanket up to her chin. "Good night, Richard." He got the message. "Good night, Sarah." Leaving the room, Richard felt he was beginning to put together the pieces of a much larger and darker puzzle than he had imagined. Sarah's mother, her work, the mysterious Uncle Jack, the disappearance, and that mark on the girl's neck. There was a story there, a story that someone wanted to keep buried. A week passed since Sarah arrived at the apartment. Richard observed the subtle changes in her behavior, how she no longer shrank when he approached, how her smiles, once so rare, began to appear more frequently. But there were also difficult moments, the nightmares that made her scream during the night, the way she was startled by sudden noises. That Sunday morning, Richard was preparing breakfast, something he was learning to do, even if in a basic way. The smell of toast and coffee filled the kitchen when Sarah appeared, still in pajamas, her hair disheveled. "Did you sleep well?" he asked, placing a cup of hot chocolate in front of her. Sarah nodded, but Richard noticed the dark circles under her eyes. Another nightmare, probably. "I thought we might go to the park today," he suggested. "It's a beautiful day. We could get ice cream." Sarah's eyes lit up for a moment, but soon after, she frowned. "What if someone sees me?" Richard understood her concern. In the past few days, he had done some discreet investigations. There were no official records of Sarah's mother's disappearance. In fact, there were practically no official records about them at all. "Don't worry," he said. "We'll go to Lincoln Park. It's big, there are lots of people, nobody will notice us." Sarah agreed hesitantly. After breakfast, she put on one of the new outfits that Nancy had bought, a floral skirt and a white blouse. With proper clothes and well-fed, she looked healthier, more like a normal child of her age. In the park, Richard watched Sarah run across the grass, chasing pigeons. It was the first time he had seen her truly act like a child. His heart ached at the thought of how long it had been since she had had this opportunity. They sat on a bench to have ice cream. Sarah licked her strawberry popsicle with total concentration, as if she wanted to savor every second of that moment. "Richard," she said suddenly, "do you have family?" The question caught him off guard. "No, I mean I had my mother, but she passed away a few years ago. I never married. Don't have siblings." "Why?" Richard thought for a moment. "I guess I focused too much on work, on building my company. I thought I would be happy that way. And aren't you?" The simplicity of the question hit him like a punch. "Not as much as I thought," he admitted. Sarah was silent for a moment, thoughtful. "My mum worked a lot too. She always said it was to give me a better life." Her voice trembled slightly. "Sometimes she came home late, seemed worried, but she always hugged me and said everything would be okay." Richard felt they were getting somewhere important. "Where did she work, Sarah?" The girl hesitated. "It was a big place, a building with many glass windows." She stopped as if trying to remember something. "There was a big sign at the entrance, but I couldn't read well at the time." "Did you ever go there?" Sarah nodded. "Just once. Mom had to take me because she had no one to leave me with. She was very nervous that day. Her eyes were lost in a distant memory. That's when I met Uncle Jack. He was different back then. He smiled more. Richard processed each word carefully. And your mum? How was she with him? Sarah's face closed. I don't want to talk about that anymore. Richard knew he shouldn't. Push? He changed the subject, suggesting they take a walk around the lake. Sarah readily accepted, the moment of tension apparently forgotten. They spent the rest of the morning walking through the park. Sarah was enchanted by the peacocks, laughed at the squirrels in the trees, was fascinated by the ducklings in the bee lake. For a few hours, she seemed to have forgotten all the fear and sadness she carried. On the way home, however, something changed. As they waited for the elevator in the building's parking garage, Sarah suddenly grabbed Richard's arm. There's someone over there, she whispered, pointing to a car parked in the shadows. Richard looked in the indicated direction, but saw nothing beyond empty vehicles. Still, the fear in Sarah's voice was too real to ignore. Come, he said, picking her up. There's nobody here. You're safe. With me. In the apartment, Sarah ran to her room and closed the curtain. Richard found her sitting on the bed, hugging her. Knees, one want to tell me what happened? She shook her head negatively. I thought I saw it, but it can't be him. Uncle Jack. Sarah shuddered at the name. He always said he'd find me, no matter where I went, that he knew people, that he knew everything. Richard sat beside her. Sarah, I need you to trust me. If you know more about what happened to your mother, I can help better. For a long moment, Sarah was silent. When she spoke, her voice was just a whisper. Mom discovered something bad, something they did at that place where she worked. She swallowed hard. One night she woke me up crying. She said we needed to run, that it wasn't safe to stay, but before we could leave, her voice failed. Richard waited, his heart beating fast. Is that when she disappeared? He asked gently. Sarah nodded, tears silently streaming down her face. Uncle Jack showed up the next day, said she had gone away, that she had abandoned me. But I know it's not true. She would never... A noise from the living room interrupted her speech. It was just the wind hitting a poorly closed window, but Sarah jumped from the bed in panic. He's going to find me, she whispered, trembling. Like he found Mom. Richard hugged her tightly, feeling her small body shake. No, he won't, I promise. But as he held her, his mind was working furiously. What exactly had Sarah's mother discovered? What was that place where she worked? And what was Uncle Jack's real relationship to all this? More importantly, had Sarah really seen someone in the parking garage? Or was it just her fear manifesting? Richard had the uncomfortable feeling that they were being watched. And if they were, what did that mean? Night fell over Chicago, bringing with it a fine rain. In Sarah's room, Richard sat beside her until she fell asleep, as he had done every night since she arrived. But this time his thoughts were far away. Something told him they needed to be more careful, that the danger Sarah feared so much might be more real than he imagined. On Monday, Richard decided to return to the office. He couldn't continue managing the company just by phone, and Nancy was already having difficulties justifying his absence. Sarah would stay at home with Nancy looking after her, an arrangement the girl accepted after much reluctance. I'll be back before nightfall, he promised, adjusting his tie in front of the mirror. Nancy will stay with you the whole time. Sarah, sitting on the still unmade bed, just nodded. Her eyes didn't leave him, as if she feared that, like her mother, he too might disappear when going out the door. In the elevator, Richard met Nancy, who was arriving to stay with Sarah. Are you sure you don't want me to call social services? She asked for the 10th time since meeting Sarah. What you're doing, it's not exactly legal. Not for now, he answered firmly. There's something bigger happening here, Nancy. I need to understand what it is before involving the authorities. At the office, Richard could barely concentrate on the meetings. His mind constantly returned to Sarah, to the fragments of story she had revealed. A building with glass windows, an important discovery, an interrupted escape. During his lunch break, which he spent locked in his office, he began to search through old employee folders on his computer. Morgan Developments was a large company with hundreds of employees. If Sarah's mother had really worked there, the phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. It was Nancy. Is everything okay? He asked, immediately alert. Yes, she answered quickly. Sarah is fine. Just finished lunch. But there's something you need to see when you get back. What is it? Sarah was drawing. They're strange drawings, Richard, and there's something written on the back of one of them. I think you should take a look. Richard looked at the clock. It was still 2 in the afternoon. Keep the drawings. I'll be there in 2 hours. He spent the rest of the afternoon dispatching the most urgent work, delegating what he could. At 4 o'clock, he was in the elevator back home. He found Sarah sleeping on the sofa, a children's program playing softly on the television. Nancy was waiting for him in the kitchen, holding several sheets of paper. "Look at this," she said, spreading the drawings on the table. Richard felt his heart tighten. The drawings were gloomy for a child of that age. In one of them, a female figure was surrounded by dark shadows. In another, a small house with a red mark on the door. And, in the last one, "Turn it over," said Nancy. On the back of the last drawing was something written in an adult's handwriting already half erased. MD, Basement 3, File 342. "What do you think it means?" asked Nancy. Richard picked up the paper, studying the faded letters. Where did she get this? It was in her old backpack. She said it was her mother's, but she wouldn't say anything else. At that moment, they heard a noise coming from the living room. Sarah had woken up and was standing at the kitchen door, looking at the scattered drawings with wide eyes. "You weren't supposed to show," she said, her voice trembling. "She said not to show anyone." Richard approached her slowly. "Who said, Sarah?" "My mum!" Sarah started to cry. "It was her secret. She kept it in a special place, thought no one knew. But he found out. He always found out everything." Richard knelt in front of her. "Sarah, I need you to tell me, what do these letters mean, MD?" Sarah shook her head violently. "I can't. He'll hurt you too." "Nobody is going to hurt anyone," said Richard firmly. "But I need to know the truth to be able to protect you, to find out what happened to your mother." Sarah looked at him for a long time, as if assessing whether she could really trust him. Finally, she whispered, "It was where she worked, a big building with the name in front." Richard felt a shiver run down his spine. "MD, Morgan Developments?" "Sarah," he said, trying to keep his voice calm, "did your mother work at my company?" The girl's eyes widened in recognition. "It was yours. The big building was yours." Richard nodded slowly, his mind working furiously. Nancy, who was watching the scene, let out an exclamation of surprise. "And Uncle Jack?" asked Richard. "Did he also work there?" Sarah started to tremble. He stayed in the basement. Mum said he kept the bad secrets down there." Richard stood up abruptly. Basement 3 of Morgan Developments was the dead file. Old documents, records that no one had consulted for years. Or at least that's what he thought. "Nancy," he said, his voice taking on an urgent tone, "stay with her. I need to go to the company." "No," Sarah grabbed his leg. "Don't go. He'll get you too." Richard hugged her tightly. "Nothing will happen. To me, I promise. But I need to find out what your mother found." As he headed back to the office, now practically empty at the end of the workday, Richard felt his heart beating fast. Years managing Morgan Developments, and he had never paid much attention to the dead file in the basement. What could be there that was so important? What had Sarah's mother discovered that had cost her disappearance? And more importantly, who was Uncle Jack really? And what secrets was he keeping in the company's files? Basement 3 of Morgan Developments was a rarely visited place. Richard descended the emergency stairs. He didn't want to use the elevator and register his presence in the system, feeling the air become heavier with each flight of stairs. His flashlight illuminated the concrete walls, creating unsettling shadows. The last words of Sarah before he left echoed in his mind. Mum said there were bad things stored down there, things that nobody could know. The dead file occupied a considerable area. Metal shelves extended through poorly lit corridors, full of boxes and folders yellowed by time. The smell of old paper and moisture was suffocating. Richard consulted again the number noted from Sarah's drawing, File 342. He began to walk down the corridors, his flashlight revealing the numbering. 338, 339, 340. A noise made him stop. Someone else was down there. He instinctively turned off the flashlight, staying in absolute silence. For a few seconds he heard nothing but his own breathing. Then again, the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Richard leaned against one of the shelves, his heart beating fast. The footsteps were approaching, accompanied by the beam of a flashlight dancing on the walls. "Is someone there?" A male voice echoed through the archive. "This area is restricted." Richard recognized the voice. It was Dan, the night security guard. He breathed a sigh of relief. "It's me, Dan," he answered, turning his flashlight back on. "Richard Morgan." The security guard appeared at the end of the corridor, surprised. "Mr. Morgan, what are you doing here at this hour?" "I needed to check some old documents," he answered, trying to sound casual. "Sorry I didn't let you know." Dan nodded, but Richard noticed something strange in his expression. "You came alone?" "Yes. Why?" "Nothing," the security guard answered quickly. "Just that earlier I saw someone coming down here. I thought it might be you." Richard felt a shiver. "Who?" "I couldn't see clearly when I went to check. There was no one." Richard pretended disinterest, but his mind was alert. "Well, now I'm here. You can leave it to me to close up everything when I'm done." The security guard hesitated for a moment, but ended up agreeing. "As you wish, Mr. Morgan. Just don't stay too long. This place, it's not good to be here alone at night." After Dan left, Richard continued his search, now with more urgency. Finally, he found shelf 342. It was the same as the others except for one detail. There were recent marks of movement in the dust on the floor. Someone had been there recently. With hands trembling slightly, he began to examine the folders. Most contained common administrative documents, old payrolls, expired contracts. But at the bottom of one of the boxes, he found something different. It was a red folder without identification. Inside, there were documents about a company expansion project from 5 years ago. Richard vaguely remembered the construction of a new business complex that ended up not going forward. As he read, his stomach tightened. The documents revealed a scheme of irregular evictions, bribes to inspectors, forged environmental reports, and there was a list. Families that would be evicted for the construction of the complex. On the third page of the list, a name made. His blood freeze, Hannah Smith. Next to the name, a handwritten note. Employee, Financial Department, access to records, potential problem. Richard let the folder fall, his hands trembling. Hannah Smith. Could that be Sarah's mother? And if so, what exactly had she discovered? A noise made him turn abruptly. At the end of the corridor, a shadow moved. "Who's there?" he called, his voice echoing among the shelves. Silence. Richard quickly put the folder back where he had found it and began heading toward the exit. His steps echoed on the concrete floor, and the feeling of being watched didn't leave him. He was almost at the stairs when he heard a voice behind him. "You shouldn't have come here, Mr. Morgan." He turned around. At the end of the corridor, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was Jack. "How did you get in here?" asked Richard, trying to keep his voice firm. Jack smiled, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I never left, Mr. Morgan. This place is my responsibility. Always has been." Richard took a step back. "You worked here." "Work," corrected Jack. "For 15 years, taking care of the files, of the secrets." He paused. "How is Sarah?" The casual tone with which he mentioned the girl's name made Richard feel a shiver of anger. "Away from you." "For now," replied Jack, still smiling. "But you know, secrets have a way of coming to light. Her mother discovered that in the worst way." "Where is Hannah?" demanded Richard. Jack's smile disappeared. "Some questions are better not asked, Mr. Morgan, for everyone's good, including little Sarah's." Before Richard could respond, the lights in the corridor flickered and went out for a second. When they came back on, Jack had disappeared. Richard ran up the stairs, his heart beating uncontrollably. Only when he was inside his car with the doors locked did he allow himself to breathe. Was what had just happened real? Jack had worked at his company for 15 years, taking care of the files in the basement, and he had never known. And what had happened to Hannah Smith? He drove back home at high speed, his mind a confusion of thoughts. One thing was certain. Sarah was right about the danger, and now he was involved too. When he arrived home, he found Sarah awake, waiting for him in the living room. Seeing him, she ran and hugged him tightly. "You came back," she whispered, as if she didn't believe. "Yes, I came back," he answered, hugging her back. "And I won't let anything happen to you, I promise." But as he held her, Richard wondered if he could really keep that promise, because now he knew the secrets buried in the basement of his company were darker than he had ever imagined. And Jack, the man who kept them, was closer than they thought. Richard couldn't sleep that night. Sitting in the armchair in his room, he watched the city through the window while his mind tried to process everything he had discovered. The red folder, Hannah Smith's name, the encounter with Jack. Each piece of the puzzle revealed a more disturbing image. The sun had not yet risen when his cell phone vibrated. It was a message from Nancy. "I need to show you something urgent." 15 minutes later, she entered the apartment carrying an old folder. Her hands were trembling slightly. "I spent the night searching through the company's digitized archives," she said, spreading some papers on the kitchen table. "Look at this." It was an old photo from a company gathering dated 5 years ago. In the image, dozens of employees smiled at the camera. Nancy pointed to a woman in the corner of the photo, young, beautiful, with the same large eyes as Sarah. "Hannah Smith," whispered Richard. "Her mother." Nancy nodded. "She worked in the finance department, disappeared 11 months ago after suddenly resigning." She paused. "But there's more." She slid another document across the table, an internal report marked as confidential. 2 weeks before disappearing, Hannah accessed various files related to the business complex project in the East Zone, the same project that was suddenly cancelled without explanation. Richard felt his stomach churn. The project with the irregular evictions. Exactly. And look who was responsible for supervising the documents at the time. The name on the paper made Richard freeze. Jack Wilson, Documentation and Archives Supervisor. A noise from the hallway interrupted them. Sarah was standing at the kitchen door, still in pajamas, staring fixedly at the photo on the table. "Mom," she whispered, her voice choked. Richard quickly put away the documents, but it was too late. Sarah approached, her eyes fixed on the image of her mother. "She was happy that day," said Sarah, gently touching her mother's face in the photograph. "It was when she got the promotion. She said she could finally give me a better life." "Her," voice failed, "but then—" "Then what, Sarah?" asked Richard gently. Sarah took a deep breath, as if gathering courage. "She started coming home late. Sometimes she cried when she thought I was sleeping. One night I heard her on the phone saying she couldn't be part of that anymore, that it was wrong." The girl swallowed hard. "That's when Uncle Jack started, showing up at our house more." Richard and Nancy exchanged glances. "Sarah," he said carefully, "did your mother ever mention documents, important papers?" Sarah nodded slowly. "She kept a folder under the mattress, red like that one." She pointed to the folder Nancy had brought. "One night, I woke up and saw her burning papers in the sink. She was crying. When I asked what it was, she just said they were bad things, that she needed to get rid of them." Richard felt a shiver. "And then?" "The next day she woke me up very early. Said we needed to leave, that it wasn't safe anymore." Sarah began to tremble. "But when we were leaving the house, he was there." "Jack?" Sarah agreed with a nod. "He seemed different, angry. Mom told me to run and hide. She said—" Tears began to stream down her face. "She said she loved me, that she would never abandon me. It was the last time I saw her." Richard hugged her tightly, feeling her small body sob. Nancy was discreetly wiping her own eyes. "And then?" asked Richard. "Softly. Uncle Jack found me, said Mom had gone away, that she had abandoned me, that now he would take care of me." Sarah moved away a bit, her eyes full of a mixture of fear and anger. "But it was a lie. He hurt her. I know he did." Richard exchanged another look with Nancy. How do you know that, Sarah? The girl instinctively touched the scar on her neck. Because he hurt me too. When I asked about Mom when I didn't obey, her voice failed. He said it was for my own good, that I needed to learn to be quiet, just like my mom should have been. The silence that followed was heavy, interrupted only by Sarah's contained sobs. Richard felt a growing anger bubbling in his chest. His own company, his own files, had been used for something terrible. And Jack, that monster, was still out there, probably looking for Sarah. "Nancy," he said finally, "I need you to do something for me. Anything. I want all. The records from the finance department from 5 years ago, especially those related to the East Zone project, and I need to know exactly who had access to Basement 3 at that time." Nancy nodded, already gathering her things. "I'll start right away." After she left, Richard continued to embrace Sarah, who gradually calmed down. "Are you going to find my mom?" she asked, her voice small and hopeful. Richard kissed the top of her head. "I'll do everything I can, I promise." But as he held her, a sense of urgency grew in his chest. Jack knew he was investigating. He knew where to find them, and if Hannah had really discovered something so serious that it justified her disappearance, how much time did they have before Jack decided to act again? The sun finally rose over Chicago, but its shadows seemed darker than ever. Somewhere in the city, hidden in dusty archives, were the secrets that had cost Hannah her freedom, and Richard knew he was running out of time to discover them. Disatti. Morning dragged on slowly in the apartment. Richard had decided not to go to the office, preferring to wait for Nancy's discoveries at home where Sarah would be safe. The girl was quiet, sitting on the sofa with a drawing pad he had bought days ago. But her eyes frequently turned to the window, as if expecting to see something or someone. The phone rang shortly after noon. It was Nancy, her voice tense on the other end of the line. "Richard, you need to see this. I can't talk on the phone. I'm coming over." 20 minutes later, she entered the apartment carrying a cardboard box. Her face was pale. "I found this hidden behind a false wall in the archive," she said, placing the box on the table. "Someone tried very hard to hide these documents." Inside the box were several folders, all related to the East Zone project. But they weren't just documents about irregular evictions. They were records of a much larger scheme. "The project wasn't just a business complex," explained Nancy, spreading out the papers. "It was a money laundering operation. Millions of dollars in inflated contracts, shell companies, offshore accounts." Richard flipped through the documents with trembling hands. He recognized several signatures, people who still worked at the Chi company, respected names in the market. "Hannah discovered everything," continued Nancy. "She worked in the financial sector, had access to the true records, and when she started to put the pieces together, Jack was assigned to watch her," completed Richard, the pieces fitting together in his mind. Nancy nodded. "He wasn't just an archivist. He was the man who ensured that secrets remained buried." A sound of something falling made them turn. Sarah was standing at the door, a broken glass at her feet, water spreading across the floor. "Sarah," Richard called softly. But the girl didn't respond. Her eyes were fixed on a photograph that had fallen from the box, an image of Jack next to several executives at a company party. "He killed her," whispered Sarah, her voice trembling. "Didn't he? That's why she never came back." Richard approached her slowly. "Sarah, we don't know—" "Yes, we do," she shouted, tears streaming down her face. "I heard them arguing that night. Mom said she was going to tell everything, that she wouldn't let them continue. And he—" Her voice failed. "He said she should think of me before doing something stupid." Richard hugged her tightly, feeling her small body shake with sobs. Nancy quickly put away the documents, her own eyes watery. "There's one more thing," said Nancy after Sarah had calmed down a bit. "I found records of a house in the name of one of the shell companies, an isolated place on the outskirts of the city." Richard felt his heart race. "What address?" Nancy handed him a paper with a note. "It's an old farmhouse, practically abandoned, but the electricity bills continue to be paid regularly." "He took her there," Sarah said suddenly. Everyone looked at her. Once, when he was drunk, Uncle Jack talked about a special place he had, where he kept important things. He said it was where people who didn't know how to stay quiet learned their lesson. Richard and Nancy exchanged glances. "I need to go there," he said. "No." Sarah grabbed his arm. "He'll hurt you too." "Sarah," said Richard, kneeling down to be at her height, "I need to find out what happened to your mother. She tried to do the right thing, tried to expose something very wrong that was happening. I can't let this continue." The girl looked at him for a long time, her large eyes full of fear and concern. Finally, she nodded slightly. "Nancy will stay with you," he continued, "and I promise I'll be careful." As he prepared to leave, Richard couldn't shake the feeling that he was about to discover something terrible. The documents Hannah had found, the isolated house, Jack's involvement, everything pointed to a dark outcome. "Richard," Sarah called when he was at the door, "if you find my mum, tell her I never believed she had abandoned me. Never." He felt his heart ache. "I will, Sarah. I promise." In the elevator, he checked once more the address Nancy had given him. The farmhouse was about an hour from Chicago, in a rural and sparsely populated area. The perfect place to hide secrets. Or people. His phone vibrated, a message from an unknown number. "Some doors are better left unopened, Mr. Morgan." He deleted the message, but its meaning was clear. Jack knew he had found the documents. He knew where he was going, and he would probably be waiting for him. The road to the farmhouse wound through an increasingly isolated region. Richard drove in silence, the only sounds being the car engine and the fine rain that had begun to fall. The GPS indicated he was approaching his destination, but Sarah's last words kept echoing in his head. Mom always said that truth was like a heavy door. Once opened, it couldn't be closed again. After a few more minutes on a dirt road, he spotted a rusty gate between old trees. The faded sign still showed the number he was looking for. The padlock was new. Someone frequented the place regularly. Richard parked his car a little before the gate and got out. The rain had increased and the ground was slippery. Following the fence, he found a spot where he could pass through. His expensive suit was now muddy, but that no longer mattered. The property was larger than he had imagined. An old house stood at the back, partially hidden by tall trees. He approached cautiously, his shoes sinking into the mud. The windows were boarded up, but there were signs of recent movement. Tire tracks in the mud, cigarette butts on the ground. He slowly circled the house, looking for an entrance. At the back, he found a door slightly ajar. His heart was beating fast when he entered. The interior was dark and dusty. Furniture covered with sheets created strange shadows. In the kitchen, he found evidence of recent use, a half-empty water bottle, a pack of cigarettes. That's when he noticed something strange on the floor. Drag marks leading to a door. A door that clearly led down to a basement. Richard hesitated. Everything in his being told him to turn back, call the police, do this the right way. But the image of Hannah in the documents, the fear in Sarah's eyes, the urgency to discover the truth, all of this pushed him to continue. With trembling hands, he opened the door. A steep staircase descended into darkness. He turned on his cell phone flashlight and began to descend, each step creaking under his feet. The basement was larger than expected, divided into several small rooms. The air was heavy, with a smell of mold and something else, something that made his stomach turn. In the first room, he found several stacked boxes. They were documents, more records of the scheme, contracts, receipts, everything meticulously organized. In the second room, there was a table with an old computer and various files scattered around. On the wall, photos and newspaper clippings formed a kind of panel. Richard approached, his blood freezing as he recognized the faces. They were all people who had disappeared in recent years. In one of the photos, Hannah's face stared back at him. But it was in the last room that his heart almost stopped. It was a small space with an old bed against the wall. In the corner, there was a chain attached to the wall. And on the small table beside it, a dusty teddy bear, identical to the one Sarah carried on the streets. She stayed here for 3 days. The voice behind him made Richard turn abruptly. Jack was standing at the door, a strangely calm expression on his face. "What did you do to her?" Richard's voice trembled with anger. Jack entered the room slowly. "You know what the problem is with people like Hannah, Mr. Morgan. They don't know when to stop. They think they can change the world, expose the truth, bring justice." He laughed bitterly, as if the truth would make any difference. "Where is she?" "She had a chance to cooperate," continued Jack, ignoring the question. "I explained that it was better for everyone, especially for little Sarah, but she was too stubborn." He sighed. "Just like her daughter." Richard took a step toward him. "If you laid a finger on her, what, you'll report me?" Jack smiled. "To whom? Half the people involved in this scheme still work at your company, Mr. Morgan. The other half are in even higher positions now." "You're a monster." "No, sir. I'm just a dedicated employee. Someone needs to keep the secrets buried, right? Some truths are too heavy." A noise from upstairs made both look at the ceiling. Footsteps. "Ah," said Jack, his smile widening. "It seems we have more visitors." Richard felt his blood freeze. Who else could be there? More people involved in the scheme. "You know," continued Jack, "when I saw you going down to the archives that night, I knew this would happen. History repeating itself, just like with Hannah." He took a step toward the door. "Some people simply don't know how to leave the past buried." The footsteps were approaching the basement stairs. Richard looked around, searching for an exit, a weapon, anything. But he was cornered. Jack continued smiling that cold smile. "Don't worry, Mr. Morgan. Soon enough you'll understand everything. And who knows?" He made a dramatic pause. "Maybe you'll even find Hannah." The footsteps were getting closer, and Richard, for the first time since this whole story began, felt true fear. The footsteps reached the top of the basement stairs. Richard could hear the creaking of the wooden steps as someone descended. Jack remained standing at the door, that unsettling smile still on his face. Then, a female voice cut through the darkness. "Jack, are you down there?" Jack's smile faltered. For a moment, that wasn't the voice he'd expected to hear. Nancy appeared at the door of the room, breathless. Her eyes widened when she saw the scene. Richard cornered, Jack blocking the exit. "Nancy?" Richard's voice was laden with surprise and concern. "What are you doing here? You were supposed to be with Sarah." "Sarah is safe," she quickly replied. "But I needed to warn you. The police are on their way." It was Jack's turn to lose his smile. "What have you done?" Nancy took a step back, but her voice remained firm. "I did what I should have done a long time ago. I knew, Jack. I always knew." "Knew? What?" asked Richard. "Hannah was my friend," Nancy replied, her voice trembling slightly. "When she started investigating the irregularities, she came to talk to me. I advised her to let it go, said it was dangerous." Tears began to stream down her face. "The morning she disappeared, she had left me an envelope. Documents, evidence, everything. But I was scared. I kept it all and did nothing." Jack took a step toward her. "Where are those documents?" "It doesn't matter anymore," she replied. "I've sent everything to the authorities." "Hey, it's over, Jack." A heavy silence fell over the basement. Richard could hear the sound of the rain outside, stronger now. "You don't understand," said Jack, his voice dangerously calm. "Nothing is over. This is bigger than all of us. Some very powerful people won't let this come to light." "Where is Hannah?" demanded Nancy. "What did you do to her?" Jack let out a bitter laugh. Hannah. Everyone's so worried about Hannah. She had her chance. She could have stayed quiet, continued her life. But no." He shook his head. "Some people need to learn the hard way." "You monster!" Nancy moved toward him, but Richard held her back. "Is the police really coming?" he whispered. Nancy nodded. "In 10 minutes. I needed to get here before them. I needed to be sure." A thunderclap echoed outside, making the basement walls shudder. Jack looked at the ceiling, then at the stairs. 10 minutes, he muttered. "Enough time." Everything happened very quickly. Jack moved toward the exit, pushing Nancy against the wall. Richard tried to reach him but slipped on the wet floor. "Jack!" he shouted. "You won't be able to escape." Jack stopped at the top of the stairs, looking down. The heavy rain could now be clearly heard. "I'm not escaping, Mr. Morgan," he replied. "I just need to resolve one last thing." His face contorted into a sinister smile. "Little Sarah is still waiting, isn't she?" Richard's blood froze. "Sarah is safe. You won't get near her." "Safe?" Jack laughed. "With whom? The babysitter you hired in a hurry when Nancy left? The one whose references you didn't even properly check?" Richard looked at Nancy, who had turned pale. "He's bluffing," she said. "Sarah is with Mrs. Wilson, my neighbor. He doesn't know where—" "Oak Street 237, apartment 12, interrupted Jack. "Mrs. Wilson, 68 years old, widow, lives alone with 3 cats. He smiled at the horror on their faces. "I always know everything, remember?" Before they could react, Jack disappeared through the door. Richard ran up the stairs with Nancy right behind him, but when they reached the yard, they only saw the headlights of a car moving away on the muddy road. "My God," whispered Nancy. "Sarah." Richard already had his cell phone in his hand, frantically dialing. "We need to warn the police, change their route. Sarah is in danger." But as he tried to make the call, his hands trembling in the heavy rain, he knew they were at a disadvantage. Jack had years of advantage over them. Years of observing, planning, controlling every detail. The only hope was that the police would arrive in time, because if they didn't, Richard couldn't even complete the thought. He couldn't fail Sarah, not like he had failed Hannah. The sound of sirens began to echo in the distance, mixed with thunder. It was a race against time, and this time the price of defeat would be too high to bear. Chicago's traffic had never seemed so unbearable as on that night. Richard drove his car at high speed along the highway, dangerously weaving between other vehicles, while Nancy continued trying to contact Mrs. Wilson. "Nothing," she said, desperation evident in her voice. "She's not answering." The rain lashed the windshield, making visibility difficult. The police sirens could be heard not far away, but Richard didn't know if they would arrive in time. Jack had the advantage. He knew the streets, knew the shortcuts, and most importantly, he knew exactly where he was going. "How did he know?" muttered Nancy, more to herself than to Richard. "How did he always know everything?" "He wasn't just an archivist," Richard replied, making a sharp turn. "He was the man everyone used to do their dirty work. What he kept wasn't just documents. They were secrets, information, details about everyone involved. And I gave Sarah right into his hands," Nancy's voice broke. "I should have stayed with her." "It's not your fault," Richard cut in. "The fault is mine. All of this started at my company, right under my nose, and I never noticed anything." A particularly strong thunderclap made the car tremble. Richard thought of Sarah, alone with Mrs. Wilson, unaware of the danger approaching. He thought of Hannah, who had tried to do the right thing and paid the highest price. His cell phone rang. It was one of the police officers Nancy had contacted. "We found something in the basement," said the officer. "You need to see this." "We don't have time now," Richard replied. "Jack is going after the girl." "It's about Hannah Smith." The officer's voice turned serious. "We found a diary. The last entries. You need to know what happened." Richard felt his heart tighten. "What? What did you find?" "She didn't die that night," said the officer. "At least not immediately. The entries continue for weeks after the supposed disappearance. The last entry," he paused. "She managed to escape. She was planning to get her daughter, but she needed to gather evidence first. She needed to ensure it would be safe." Richard almost lost control of the car. "She's alive?" "The last entry is from 3 months ago. She wrote that she finally had all the evidence, that she was going to set everything right with help from someone inside the company, someone who had access to—" The call dropped. Richard looked at his cell phone in frustration, then something hit him. "Nancy," he said slowly, "how did you know where to find us today?" She didn't immediately respond. When she did, her voice was different. "You weren't the only one Hannah approached back then," she finally said. I helped her hide. That's why I kept the documents. I was waiting for the right moment." You knew she was alive all this time? Nancy nodded, tears streaming down her face. She made me promise not to tell anyone, not even Sarah. It was too dangerous. She was gathering more evidence, preparing everything. Where is she? I don't know exactly. We communicated through a secure system. She said when everything was ready, she would let me know. The last contact was 3 days ago. She said... Nancy swallowed hard. She said it was time that she could finally get Sarah. Richard felt his stomach churn. Jack found out. Yes, whispered Nancy. That's why he's going after Sarah now. It's not just to silence her. It's to lure Hannah. At that moment, Nancy's cell phone rang. It was a text message from an unknown number. Pine Street 42, come alone or the girl dies. That's not Mrs. Wilson's address, said Nancy, confused. No, replied Richard, making a sharp turn. It's an abandoned warehouse, former company property. As he drove through the rainy night, Richard tried to organize his thoughts. Hannah was alive. She had spent all this time preparing, gathering evidence, trying to protect her daughter the only way she could. And now? She'll be there, said Nancy, as if reading his thoughts. If she knows Sarah is in danger, she'll show up. That's exactly what Jack wants. The city lights passed like blurs through the car window. Somewhere ahead, Jack was taking Sarah to a trap. And somewhere in the night, Hannah was finally coming back to get her daughter. The storm roared over Chicago, but the real tempest was just beginning. The abandoned warehouse loomed like a shadow against the stormy sky. Richard parked his car at a safe distance, the rain still falling heavily. Through the rusty gates, he could see a faint light coming from inside the building. Are you sure you don't want to wait for the police? Asked Nancy, her voice trembling. Richard shook his head. We don't have time. Sarah needs us now. They crossed the muddy terrain, trying to make as little noise as possible. The warehouse door was ajar, a broken chain hanging from the hinges. The interior was a large empty space with some improvised partitions creating irregular shadows. The light came from a single lamp in the center of the place, illuminating a scene that made Richard's heart stop. Sarah was sitting in a chair, her hands tied behind her back. She didn't appear to be hurt, but her face was marked by tears. Jack was beside her, a hand on her shoulder, like a silent reminder of his threat. Welcome, he said, his voice echoing in the empty space. I was expecting more guests, but we'll start without them. Let her go, Jack, said Richard, taking a step forward. It's over. The police are on their way with all the evidence. Jack smiled. Evidence? You really think papers and documents mean anything? The right people can always make evidence disappear. He lightly squeezed Sarah's shoulder, making her shudder. People, on the other hand. Why? Asked Nancy. Why do all this? Because it's my job, he replied simply. It always has been. When we build something, Nancy, we need to protect the foundations, no matter the cost. A noise from the back of the warehouse made everyone turn. A figure emerged from the shadows, and Sarah let out a muffled cry. Mom! Hannah Smith looked thinner and older than in the photo, but her eyes still had the same intensity. She stopped a few meters away, her gaze fixed on Jack. Let my daughter go. Her voice was firm, without fear. Jack smiled. Hannah, it's been a while. I was beginning to think you wouldn't come. You knew I would. Come, you always knew where I was, didn't you? Of course I did, but I needed to wait for the right moment. Wait for you to gather all your precious evidence. He paused. By the way, thank you for leading me straight to it. Hannah's face paled. What are you talking about? Your hiding place wasn't as safe as you thought. While you're here, my friends are paying a visit to your temporary apartment, that place on Jefferson Heights, right? Hannah closed her eyes for a moment, defeated. All her work, all the evidence she had gathered. It doesn't matter, she finally said. They aren't the only copies. It was Jack's turn to lose his smile. What? You really think I would be so careless? Hannah took a step forward. Every document, every piece of evidence I gathered in the last few months has been sent to several people. If anything happens, to me or Sarah, it all comes to light. A thunderclap shook the warehouse. In the brief light of the lightning, Richard saw something change in Jack's face. For the first time, there was fear in his eyes. "You're bluffing," he said, but his voice betrayed uncertainty. "Want to risk it?" Hannah took another step. "How? Long until your powerful friends discover you're no longer useful, that you can no longer keep the secrets buried." Jack roughly pulled Sarah, making her scream. "Don't come any closer." It was the moment Richard had been waiting for. In a quick movement, he charged at Jack, while Nancy ran to grab Sarah. In the confusion, Hannah also moved. There was a brief struggle. Jack was stronger than he looked, but he was outnumbered. In seconds, he was immobilized on the ground. Sarah ran into her mother's arms, sobbing. Hannah hugged her tightly, tears streaming down her face. "Forgive me, my love," she whispered. "Forgive me for taking so long." The sound of sirens filled the air. Blue and red lights began to illuminate the interior of the warehouse through the broken windows. "It's over," said Richard, still holding Jack. "It really is over." The following hours were a blur of statements, police officers, and revelations. The scheme was even bigger than they had imagined. Jack had been just the tip of the iceberg. Various executives and politicians were involved. The evidence Hannah had gathered, strategically spread across different places, was devastating. When the sun finally rose, Richard watched from a distance as Sarah slept in her mother's lap inside a police car. Hannah gently stroked her daughter's hair, as if afraid she might disappear at any moment. Nancy approached him. "What happens now?" "A lot will change," he replied. "The company, the people involved. It will be a long process." "And you? How do you feel?" Richard thought for a moment. A week ago, he had been ready to give up everything. Now, for the first time in a long time, he said, "I feel like I did the right thing." Hannah saw him and signaled for him to approach. When he got close, Sarah woke up and smiled at him, a true smile without fear. "Thank you," said Hannah, "for taking care of her, for not giving up." Richard looked at Sarah, then at Hannah. "Actually, she's the one who took care of me. That night on the bridge, and she saved me without knowing it." Sarah extended her hand and held his. "Are we a family now?" Hannah and Richard exchanged surprised looks, then smiled. "Yes," he replied, "I think we are." The rain had finally stopped. On the horizon, the sun was rising over Chicago, its golden lights making the puddles of water shine like mirrors. A new day was beginning, bringing with it the promise of new beginnings and second chances. For Sarah and Hannah, it was the end of a long night of separation and fear. For Richard, it was the beginning of something he had lost a long time ago, a purpose, a family, a reason to continue. And as he watched mother and daughter embracing, Richard understood that sometimes we need to completely lose ourselves to find our way back home. Sometimes the people we try to save end up saving us.